Today I'm going to break down a heavy dubstep drop for you. Here's what we'll be breaking down. We're going to be going through each of the drop sections and how they differ in their sound design, arrangement, and mixing. You can grab this entire project for free down below to dissect it yourself, and let's hop in. All right, so because the drums are pretty similar between all four of these 8-bar sections, we're going to start by talking about the drums. Super important in heavy dubstep that you get your sample selection and drum programming right. I actually recommend doing this first before you sort of do any bass design or selection, because that way you're getting that backbone, that strong backbone of your track done early. Now, as you can see here, we've got a kick, a snare, we've got some rides, background hats, and a main hi-hat. You don't need tons of drum layers in dubstep to really fill it out. You do want to leave space for the basses to really fill out the spectrum, though I do think it is helpful to have a few key hats and percussion hits. So let's start with our main two, which is kick and snare. Absolutely critical. I have used two samples to layer both the kick and the snare in this case. One of them is going to definitely be doing the heavy lifting in both cases, but it is helpful just to layer a second one in just for a little bit of extra something sometimes. So let's listen to the kick first. Sounding pretty good. Just gonna turn off my drum group limiter for now. Sounds pretty much like that. I mean, I might even just really quickly turn off the mastering chain as well, so you can hear what it sounds like before that. Mastering chain is just adding a bit more compression and distortion, but it sounds pretty similar, right? Now, this is made up of two layers. This one, that's like that main layer, right? Nothing really going on there. It's just a great quality sample at its original pitch. Sounds like that. And I'm just simply giving it a bit of a top/mid-end boost just to get the transient cutting through a little more. Using a high shelf, great technique if you're wanting to, in a non-destructive way, just get a little more out of your transient. Just boost this top end of your kick drum, because there's no real tail in the top end, right? Unless there's a bit of noise. But I actually liked the noise coming out of that kick drum, so I didn't mind that I added a bit more. Then I added this layer in, which is just providing a bit of like acoustic ambience to it, which I quite liked the effect of. This is high pass, so the bass isn't conflicting. Super important when you're layering kicks in dubstep that generally one is doing the sub stuff and the other layers are either just transient or texture, like this kick here. If you are layering multiple kicks together, sometimes it's like more helpful to sort of like splice them together. Sometimes like just the tail of one on top of the other and sort of fade it. That's how I would do it if I was to approach it like that. But in this case, I didn't want to do that. So I'm going to undo that there. And that's our kick. It's just going into a clipper to make sure none of the transients go over 0 dB. Good to put some sort of limiting or clipping when you're layering kicks together. It's absolutely crucial to make sure you don't mess the dynamics up, especially when you're processing or layering stuff. And that kick is pretty much just on the 1, and therefore, you know, the beginning of each bar, really. Snare on the 3. So I've got a very basic pattern here. As you'll notice, there's a few fills at the end of the 8-bar section where there's a double quarter note kick. That's pretty much it. Snare is similar. I have one snare layer here, and then a top layer, which is sort of the noisy layer. It's a Virtual Riot sample that I've layered in with this sort of more solid, chunky dubstep snare. I wanted that old school, like huge 200 hertz fundamental sound with this more modern, bright top end. I've just chucked a clipper on the top end because sometimes when you're high passing and EQing, you can add some sort of peak artifacts, so that just controls those. Together, it sounds like this. Obviously, the bottom one here is more prominent in volume. But that's honestly because the tops layer in the actual sample is super clipped already, so I don't really need tons of volume from it. Sound really, really good together. In terms of like pitch and stuff like that, these two samples just sounded great at their original pitch. Sometimes I might pitch a little bit of one up to get it in context, sounding better. What I have done here on the main snare, though, is just use a bit of transient designing, just getting the snare punch a little more clear. Especially because I was clipping them together. I just wanted it to go into the clipper with a bit of transient front loaded. Sounds really good together. And again, just because we're layering snares, we just want to make sure that tail is getting, that transient is getting chopped off quite nicely. It still retains the perceived loudness. So even though we're clipping, it doesn't it still has that nice transient effect we're going for. Anyway, that's the kick and the snare. Just volume balance those two groups together like I have done here. And that's really the backbone of your track, right? If I just solo those. Sounds fantastic to me. I might even ease back a little bit on this top shelf boost on that layer. Sounds pretty good though. Then I just have a few other layers. I got a hat on the offbeat. So this is going to be on your 2 and 4 at this 150 BPM tempo we're at, which is very standard for dubstep, by the way. Very simple, just a sample. No processing at all. In fact, I'm just going to delete these defaults I've got loaded up here because there's literally nothing going on. I've just turned it down to sort of sit at a nice volume between the kick and snare. A little bit of reverb baked in the sample. I have actually sent also a little bit of it to my drums verb here, which is just a bright room reverb to add a bit of space. I think I did that on the snare a bit here too, but not on the kick, just to add a bit of room space. Quite nice there. I do mute the hat occasionally, as you can see here, just because certain bass hits, which I'll get to soon, sound more like impactful when the hat's not rolling through in the background. You'll see that this is the same with my rides and background hats here too. But those three hats together, that's the bulk of the pattern there, right? Lots of space left for bass sounds and whatnot to come in. Now as well, there's also two other layers. There's rides. This ride hits on every half note. So every time there's a snare or a kick. It is also sidechained, which I'll get to in a second. Creates a bit of noisy texture. Some people like to do it every quarter note. Quarter note, just because it sounds a little more rapid. So you could do something like this if you wanted to. But I actually let another layer do this. And by the way, in terms of processing, this just has a bit of a low pass on it because it was just a bit bright. Don't know if you can hear that top end there. It just was a bit too much, so I just subtly controlled it. Then I have a sidechain trigger up here, which is literally just the kick drum sample. The first one shortened really far down, so it's faded right just to the transient. That's the trigger being applied to the rides, just sort of ducking the transient out the way of the ride so that the kick and snare always cut through. This is the same trigger I use for my basses. In a second, we'll go there. And then I've got this background hats sample, which is a little different. It's more of an acoustic sort of like a roomy sound, for lack of a better term. Sounds like this on its own. In fact, without all the processing on it, sounds like this. It's in a Kali sample, I believe, if it wants to get found. Anyway, without all the processing on, I'll really quickly show you. Sounds like this. Very kind of like roomy, right? With the EQ, it just takes all that low end out, gives it a bit more brightness, especially above 10K. Erosion adds a bit of noisiness to the sample. With dirties it up a bit, which I quite liked it for some texture. Bit of OTT to squash the sound, and then auto pan is just on quarter notes, fading the tail a bit to make it a bit tighter in the mix. It's really quiet in the mix. You actually can't hear it that much. You do hear it in more the second half of the drop in 1C and 1D, but it does just fill in the background, especially behind the rides, right? What I might even suggest doing is a bit more. Yeah, a bit more high end boost there, and that sounds a little better even now. It also always has another hit layered on top of it, so that's why you can't really hear it on its own, but it does just provide this nice backdrop. If I turn it off, you can kind of hear what it sounds like without it. And I'm all about just creating subtle background atmosphere in dubstep because you don't want the foreground to get too filled out. We're kind of scooping out space for our basses. So this is a really tasteful way to do that. Haven't added reverb on that one or the rides because they kind of have some built in. And then I'm just running my entire drums group with all of those faders balanced to taste. Again, kick and snare really prominently coming through. Running that through a safety limiter on transparent mode. I've got Pro L2 up here. As you have different drum layers on top of each other, you will notice certain hits just get a bit more peak volume. So this just stops that in a clean way, which I really quite liked. And obviously that's going to be also done by our mastering chain. I'm going to flick back on our mastering chain just for the sake of listening to the rest of the track now. We'll go into what it's actually doing at the end of this lesson, so pay attention and keep that in mind. Yeah, drums are pretty much the same throughout. Again, a few double kicks, few mutes. I also have some drum fills, which are more effects down the bottom here. I'll get to that in a second. Let's cover basses now, though, because that's really what we're wanting to go into. And then there's a lot of different layers in my bass group. I put pretty much all my drop sounds that are not drums in a bass group because I like to sidechain and control them all together. Even if it's like my sub, I'll do that. So let's go through 1A here because each of these 4 sections has sort of a different set of basses that I've used, which is why there's so many channels. First, let's start with the first hit, which is just a growl stab. Simple preset that I've loaded up from Splice, but I've added my own take on it. So I think this one had a bit more of the Combs filter dialed in. Yeah, like that. But I kind of liked it having a bit less. Guys, use presets, but also tweak them to your taste. Like that's the easiest way to get your own proven yet unique sounds. I've just taken a good sound here and made it my own simply by tweaking the amount of filter movement. I could have replaced the oscillators here, the filter, the LFO shape. I believe I did slow it down a bit as well in terms of the LFO. Just to make it a little more growly, but don't quote me on that. That could be a mistake. Sometimes when you do all the sound design stuff, you can't actually remember what you did in the moment, but I definitely remember adjusting the combs there a bit. I've also added a bit of EQ to this sound. This is just to get more sub because the sub from the original, there was no individual sub oscillator, so I just kind of boosted the low end to make up for that. When I have all these different bass sounds, as you'll see, I like to EQ the sub range, which is about 80 hertz and below, so that they're consistent across the sounds. This is especially the case if you're not using a separate sub, so very important to keep in mind. As for notes, I'm just using an F3, which is, F is a standard note. As for whether it's 3, 2, or 1, it really depends on the octave. It's actually more of an F0 because these oscillators are both -3, so you can think of it as an F0 if that helps. I use it on this first hit as a really great way just to introduce the drop. I alternate back to it throughout at various times, and there is a bit of a variation of it, which I'll get to in a second. Then I come to my main bass, again, which is a different preset. I just had this pitch on here, but it's not doing anything because I was playing around with the octaves. This is another preset that I've chosen to play around with. I believe this was a triplet pattern already. This one's got a decent sub built in. I think it's got some comb filtering, which I maybe played around with a little bit, but I think for the most part, I just tweaked some of these macros to taste. And that's another great way you can very easily take a normal preset and make it a bit your own. Plus I've layered it with this background bass, which gives it a unique flavor. So again, not everything has to be sound designed from scratch. I do that in this project, which I'll get to in a second, but don't feel like you need to. This is just holding out the F again. It's starting again every quarter note just to get that triplet feeling going. You can hear that side chain there. I've also modulated the movement on the sound a bit, which I believe macro 4 is moving the filter mix, which is creating sort of this nice, natural, organic movement to the sound. So it's not static. Pretty cool. You can kind of hear it here. It gets a little different. And then I have a little note down there to the 7 of the scale, which is, I think, E flat or D sharp in this case. Remember, we're in A minor. We're in F minor. I don't know why the key up here keeps changing. Sometimes it happens. And that's the main bass sound. Now I layered it with this honk, this like wonky honk sound, I guess you could call it. I don't know why I called it that. It's actually a future house bass. I believe this one is from There's another sample, another preset pack. Yeah, so this one is just a sound like this. I believe I just adjusted the amount of reverb on it because it was a bit too much originally, and then maybe a little bit of EQ afterwards. Again, you don't have to always change everything to a crazy amount from a preset. It can just be subtle tweaks, and that's what I did here as well, because it's the sum of the parts, right? This plus this is really sick. Plus I added this little bit of a, like, I think it's a 16th note, if I'm not mistaken, like offset to give it like this space in the mix. Kind of gives it a little bit of a groove too. So that's really, really fun. Again, this one had a decent amount of sub in that bass there. I did provide a little bit of processing on the group here because I do have a second version of this main bass up here, which I swapped to here. But I wanted to process them both the same, where I added a bit of Rift, which is a great plugin for just adding distortion effects. This one's kind of like a square wave bounce. Without it, you can hear it. Really just dirties it up with that sub pushing into the distortion. Absolutely one of my favorite distortion plugins. Just a preset I've chosen. Bit of multi-band comp to control it a bit more, and then just some EQ at the end to control some of the high end. It was like super bright before. Just not very nice. So that's probably Rift doing a bit too much there, plus the original sound. Yeah, and so the second variation is just a few, it's just a few sound design changes. So I think I moved this FM from B on oscillator B down the octave, as opposed to this one. Actually, yeah, so it went down an octave, and I changed the oscillator B wavetable, so it's actually a completely different sound, which is cool. Those two changes, you know, it's great to just duplicate sounds, make a few sound design changes in the oscillator or FM or effects or whatever, and you get really cool, similar but different variations. And that's what I've done here, is just FM and an octave and different wavetable. Same sound otherwise. I do have some modulation on the wet reverb, which is cool, just to add a bit of like a reverb effect here. Again, modulating the original sound just to make it a little bit of a fill effect. Quite cool. Also creates a bit of space for that growl stab to come back in, which is cool. I also have a little bit of a vocal right in this fill after the growl, just to alternate this one a bit. Yeah. With the growl, it sounds like this. Yeah. What I could probably do, honestly, is just like shorten that a little bit to give it this more attack at the beginning, because it kind of bled straight over into the sound. Yeah. That's a little cleaner now. You'll notice these little tail gaps here at the end of sounds can sometimes be huge in getting the next sound to be punchy. It's why fill into a drop when it pulls out the basses sounds so impactful. Same principle, just having a little gap there between sounds can be good in certain cases. This vocal was just one I found. It's just, again, from a sample pack on Splice. I just gave it a bit of erosion to dirty it up and make it my own. Yeah. Sounded kind of cool. In terms of, by the way, this whole bass group has multi-band comp, bit of EQ just to cut out some harshness, and Pro L2 just to control the loudness, plus sidechain after that. This is where all the sidechain is getting dialed in. Pretty intense sidechain right down to silence, but very fast. Yeah. Without sidechain, it sounds terrible. Yeah. Everything's clashing. It sounds gross. You need sidechain. Very quick, 50 milliseconds. Very short input for the sidechain. EQ it so it's just the click. Sounds like this. Ignore the stereo. Ignore my stereo bus there. I'll get to that in a second. But yeah, that's pretty much the first bass section. There is this nasty little fill here again, which is just, again, a preset I've chosen. I think this one I pretty much used as is. I didn't make any changes, so that's also fine. Maybe a bit of EQ to get the high end a bit controlled there. Just a low pass. This one's sort of a little extra funny bass. Again, just a preset I've chosen. I think I high passed it a bit just to make the sub not as impactful into the next section. So with that nasty fill, it sounds like this. And this note here is the F sharp and the F, just to create that bit of tension. I'm not just using the F for all of our bass sounds, otherwise it's pretty boring. This is an F here as well. Yeah, that's pretty cool. This bass here, the sort of wonky bass, I did tweak a few things. I tweaked this metal preset, which kind of gives it a different texture. So before it was like this. Just makes it a little brighter and more punchy in this second section, which I really liked the effect of. A new sample here. Basically as is. I think I just got this from a random sample pack I found online. Okay, so now we have a different section here, which is where I switch up the bass. So I still use the same growl here to keep things consistent, because I don't want every drop to feel, or every section of the drop to feel different. What I do though, to really emphasize the transition, is I'm muting a lot of the hats here, just keeping the ones on the first kick hit, muting the snare, and then only having it in the next bar. So just like leaving all that space. Yeah. Right, to really let this new bass, which this is an original bass, by the way. In terms of sound design, it's a acid kind of saw with a muted oscillator B FMing it, which is quite a bit higher, 4 octaves and a seventh above where this is. Still got the sub in there for that sub energy, bit of hyper to thicken it up, dimension, tube, and OTT in Ableton there. I also have like this, in Serum rather, I have this LFO1 on the master tuning, which is a great way just to add this like introduction to the sound. So it's like, rather than just from the beginning. I thought it sounded sick. So this just sort of does I think it's roughly a couple of octaves or something like that on the master tune of all oscillators. Really cool way to introduce it. Bit of raw in Ableton to add a bit of drive to it before it sounds like this. So before it's like cleaner, which is arguably cooler, but I like the drive on this to really dirty it up. Just makes it sound less like predictable, and then a bit of bass boost, OTT to control it more. Sounded really cool. Halfway through, I activate this auto pan. Now, there's a reason I'm doing it earlier in the chain, is because it actually sounds cooler when the auto pan's going into the distortion unit raw. It just gives it this cool texture. I really like that effect. If I did it at the end, it would still sound cool, don't get me wrong, but when you're adding movements before distortion and compression, it just always has this cool texture. So I always recommend that. All right, let's go to down here again. Still got this sound going back at its original pitch. I do have this background ambience as well, which is pretty cool. It's just like a lead sound, which is up at a higher octave. This is one of our presets from our next level leads pack, which you can actually grab on our free downloads page in the description. I just took this sound and really tweaked it and made it suited to the context. So I overdrove it, EQ'd it so it's more of like a band pass in the upper mids / highs. Top spreader is just adding a bit of like this stereo filter effect, which is cool. Helps it to cut through the mix. I always find using interesting creative effects to sort of help sounds cut through the mix. This is literally a preset of Ableton's auto filter. So I just played around with that and it sounded cool. Bit of OTT at the end, really intensely to help it to sit in the background but still cut through. This lifts the energy, well, of this whole next B section because this wasn't there before and it fills out the background, definitely giving you that hypey energy. People like Skrillex use this technique all the time. They might use like a vocal ambience instead of a lead to do this, or they might use like a looped ambience. Really, really cool way just to fill out your drops with unique sounds. So that's really helping that. Here we've got another sort of extra couple layers for a fill, making this fill different from the fill we used in drop A. So there's this sort of effect sound that I just loaded up as a preset using the MIDI I was using below. Just added a cool effect. And then there's this, which is just like a drum and bass sort of resound, which I thought sounded cool. High passed as sort of just like a layer on top of the sub stuff that's going on. And then I still have this nasty fill bass coming on the second note. So this is doing the sub up here. There's still something doing the sub at all times. We're just alternating it. And this is just the melodic sort of mid bass layer, providing that like extra something. Funny layer still comes in. And then here I have, I think that's up here actually, I have a tweak on one of the macros, which I believe is, macro 1 is doing the octave of B, so it's adding a higher FM effect, which makes it sound really cool. And then this bass is the original bass from drop 1A, but up the octave. Just as a cool fill effect, I think. Right. And then this background ambience lead right at the end of 1B before the transition lifts an octave to really lift the energy. So with everything going on here, it sounds like this. And then going into this little drum fill we have down here, which is the same thing I used in the intro right before the drop. This is actually like a funk sample, funnily enough. I just sped it up to a dubstep tempo. And then there's like a little tom from a Leviathan pack. So those two samples just layered together perfectly. Yeah, sounds sick. So that's drop 1B really. Not much else to it. Just good sound selection, a good arrangement. And then 1C is kind of different. I actually add the growl back in with like 100% wet reverb. So it's like the same sound, but more textural and ambient now. Sounds sick. I added an ambience in here. Bandpass and OTT. It's like a kettle sound. I'm creating this like sort of ethereal effect. It didn't really need reverb because it sounded kind of roomy enough. But I added in this new sound, which is more rhythmic. Again, this is an original sound. I kind of wanted something like chuggy and guitar-y that I decided to design myself. Inspired by a Sudden Death track, actually. It's just some analog signs with a bit of FM movement on its LFO here, kind of plucky, bit of filter movement, bit of noise there going into some distortion. I've got tons of post-processing on this, so I'm going to turn off the post-processing for now. Let's listen to it without post-processing. Now there is also some pitch wheel automation on this here. As you can see, I didn't want it to be all sort of the same note. I wanted there to be a sort of bit of natural movement every bar. So that repeats throughout, which is pretty cool. Again, just on the pitch bend, I've got up 9 and down 5. Just kind of played around with it until it sounded cool. Again, just to add a bit of movement. So that's the basic of the sound. I just rhythmically composed something that was cool with the drums. Kind of offbeat and syncopated, which was pretty cool. Again, different from the drop 1A and B, just to make it sound something different. You know, dubstep is all about sort of having sections that sound different, but also tie together well. So you'll see me reusing a few of the same sounds like that growl, but in different ways to get different effects. In terms of post-processing, I used erosion to add noise, drums bus to add a bit of crunch and transient emphasis, amp to add further sort of texture to the sound, riff to really just obliterate it, and then EQ to clean it all up at the end. Especially in the low mids, it can pile up a bit there when you've got too much distortion. It can actually pull away from your sub because the low mids can start to muddy up the mix. Also adding a bit of mid-range in there to really get it to cut through the mix, and just cutting out some harsh highs. So really each of these effects is super necessary. You'll see like with just erosion, noise, transient emphasis and crunch. Really getting dirty now. Really getting some creative distortion in there now, like beefing it out a bit more, and then EQ to clean it up. You can see how the noise needed to be sort of tamed a bit. That resonance on the high pass there, sorry, low pass, does provide like sort of a cool texture in my opinion. Makes it sound a little like almost lo-fi-ish, but in not a bad way. So I really liked this sound. I do layer it with 2 metallic sounds in this drop 1D, which I'll get to in a second. That kind of lifts the energy of it for me. And then I took the original sound that I made in Serum, and then every 4th bar added a sort of different effects chain to it to give it its own texture. I used like a Rift preset that added sort of this delay pulse thing, a bit of amp and shifter to go up the octave, and dirty it up, EQ to high pass it, and then OTT to get it to cut through. Just adds like a cool texture every 4 bars. You can kind of hear it there in the background, which is pretty cool. I also use that like effect sound here. Again, just sounds really cool and ambient. This sound as well. What did have something in here, but we're not actually using anything anymore. I liked it without the background lead. I bring that in later. This little funny sound I occasionally cut to. Just breaks it up. Got the Reese in there again as a fill. Again, drums cut out for a bit, especially the snare and hats, just to emphasize this. Chop over the vocal, just the last right phrase, and then this future house sound with that FM. But like I just crank the reverb automation like right up high, as you can see there, which is pretty cool. I don't think I use the send. No, I just used the reverb in Serum because it sounded really metallic, and I just wanted to make it more ambient in this section. I muted all the drums there besides the snare, little tom fill and kick reverse. Just the low end part, not so much the transient, so it just sounded like that. Sounded sick. And then I have basically these 2 layers coming in, slightly panned left and right, but mostly mono. They just sounded really cool together to create this like texture. Sounds kind of death steppy to me when you got that little metallic attack. Little auto filter movement there just to add a fill, high passing it out the way. Yeah, and then I did also add in this like riser sort of note. I'll call it riser note. Just a preset with a high pass really and a bit of low top end control there. Just like brings the energy up towards the end of the drop on every 2nd and 4th beat. What I may do in future is like take the original like bass sound, duplicate it. This is like just an idea I had in real life, just to layer this up a bit, copy the MIDI here and like use the original bass sound as like a 2nd sort of offset layer. I may have to pitch this all down the octave though. Something like that. Maybe it's an octave too low. yeah, that could add a cool layer in there, like the original sound kind of tying it together with this pitch riser note. Anyway, cool stuff like that can happen. I bring the ambience back in and drop 1D up here. I honestly could put a pitch riser on that as well if I really wanted to, but it's optional. There's already enough stuff going on there. I use the effect there again, the Reese. This is kind of cool because it provides that like melodic context within the middle of the drop where there's so much cool sound design stuff. This is just that little note change that keeps emphasizing that theme, which I really like. You'll also see me in these two versions here use a bit of a pitch bend, I believe. I think it's just the actual sound. If you hold down the note long enough. So I just let the note ring out as like a Reese, and it just kind of has its own effect, which is cool. And that is pretty much it, man. That's pretty much it. Yeah. The growl stab I use different notes for. Different textures because it's more of an ambience in drop 1C and 1D. That's pretty much the drop. I use a crash occasionally to emphasize certain hits. Sometimes where there's like a bass fill at the beginning of the section, I won't introduce the crash until the snare hits. So like here. But in this section, it's like kind of halfway through. Because there's a longer fill. Whereas I don't use it at all in this section because it didn't suit it. It was like kind of cool not having the crash. Then I bring it in 1D again and then right at the outro. So yeah, that's just a little bit of extra something there. I do sidechain it to the sidechain trigger just so it doesn't get away in the transient on my kick. In terms of group processing, on the bass group, bit of multiband comp. This is one of Ableton's multiband dynamics presets. I use this all the time in dubstep. Just to control things in a more subtle way than OTT does. OTT, if you use it all the time, just sounds bad. If I turn this off, versus on, it just makes all the basses kind of unified, so I really, really like it. Again, a bit of EQ just to control some upper mid harshness that was getting added in, and then limited to control it, and then the sidechain. Great. I do send some sounds to my stereo bus, which is just Ozone Imager on side only mode, providing a bit of extra new stereo stuff. So I just use that instead of adding stereo on my main master bus. It just gives me more control. Bit of drum reverb. It's like less than 1 second. It's like 0.75. Main verb. I don't think I'm using that at all, actually. Bit of bass reverb. Just like a high pass reverb that I've sidechained and compressed, so it sounds pretty cool. It sounds cool when tucked in the background. If it's too loud in the mix, kind of like the ambiences, they just overpower and fill in the mix too much. So it's very subtle, but it does make a difference. So yeah, just very subtle high pass reverb, Ableton's reverb, OTT, 1.6 seconds, so not very long. Yeah, band pass and cutting out the upper 2 to 3K because that's where we hear frequencies. I don't want it to be too present, so it really gets it out of the way of the mix to our ears. And then yeah, some sidechain. And that's pretty much the track. Now I've just got the master chain to go through. Pro Q3 here is just, again, controlling the top end of the mix. It was just overly bright, which can happen in the production process. Your high end can, as you're excited and producing, it just naturally gets high pass, so you need to pull it all back in. Again, nothing huge here. It's all less than 1.5 dB changes. You shouldn't be making any changes on your master that's more than 3 dB, in my opinion. If you are, you need to go back to the mix. Low pass here is really just rolling off the top frequencies, which are just too tinny and bright. Multiband comp again on the master, just a bit more control with the drums this time. Soothe too to notch out some harsh frequencies in the upper mids. I always just use the default preset a little bit. Very subtle. Clip it before my limiter to sort of even out the waveform. About 1 dB. Limiter's doing the bulk of the work on transparent mode. Gets it to about -6 to -5 LUFS. I could push it a little more there, but I am using my clipper for the final push. And that's really where the loudness comes in, is clipper, limiter, clipper. Absolutely game-changing signal flow for loudness. If I look at my U lean here, I'm getting about -4 to -5 there, which is cool. I probably could do a bit more smoothing out of the bass and compress the bass a bit more with some multiband on my master, but to get that low end more consistent and therefore the loudness more consistent. But it's pretty good, to be honest. It's not a major thing. So yeah, that's pretty much the track. Yeah, I don't think there's much else to go over. That's how you construct a heavy dubstep drop. Different sounds, different sections, always making little variations, but also keeping the core theme in the drop as much as you possibly can. We could use drop 1 and C for drop 2, and then drop 1A and 1B for drop 1. You could restructure these and even make a completely different version of what we've got here for drop 2. But this is how a heavy dubstep drop comes together. Feel free to use your own sounds, your own basses, your own drums that you like. Use the principles of this video. Don't just copy what I've done, although you can grab the project file down below in the description and dissect it for yourself. Any questions? Drop a comment. You know, I'm here to help. And if you liked this video, seriously, liking it does help. It's get in front of more people, and share it with somebody else. And do subscribe, because we do more videos like this all the time from myself and the EDMProd team. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed. With that, I'll leave it with you. Happy producing.